have a look at lamb performance and a few thoughts on there, because that initially was, when Robin contacted me, it was on lamb performance that she wanted to spend some time today. And really what we've done so far is a bit of a preamble that there's lots of other stuff going on, but lamb performance is really, really important. So again, I just want to flag a few things up that are important to us. Some of it will be more important to you than others, so down to you guys really to say and think about what's most important to you. But safe to say that in terms of lamb performance, there are ewe factors involved, and obviously there are lamb factors involved, and equally as important one or the other. But if you haven't got the ewe factors right, you're not going to get the lambs right anyway. So looking at those two things as we go through. Now, one of the problems that I have with our lamb producers is that they will look at that price graph there and they will say, well, I'm not really bothered about lamb growth rate, because if my lambs don't grow very well, all I'm going to do is to keep them. So if they don't grow very well, I won't have to sell them here when the price is lower. I can just keep them to this time of year when the price is higher. Yeah? There's some logic, I suppose, isn't there? But it's not very good logic. It's a risky strategy because you don't know what the price is going to do. But of course, the most important thing is that growth rate is the holy grail, because the faster a lamb grows, the more efficiently it will convert its food. So this is actually some Kiwi data. Okay, but it's really nice stuff, and it's not new stuff, but it's really good. So what this is saying to us is that if you have a lamb, and I think this was lambs growing to 40 kilos live weight, so much lighter than your lambs would be when they were finished, but it's the same principle. If you have a lamb that grows to 40 kilos, and it does it as an average of 100 grams a day, and then you compare it to a lamb that grows to the same 40 kilos, but it does it in 300 grams a day, the 300 grams a day lamb is twice as efficient as the 100 grams a day lamb, i.e. it eats half as much. That's pretty staggering when you look at it like that. But persuading my guys to really take this on board can be quite difficult. So there are also knock-on effects though, because one of the major things that I find with my farmers is that they will, and we'll talk about this a bit more in the context of body condition, but there are knock-on effects to poor growth rate, in that if you've got good growth rates and your lambs are doing well and you're finishing your lambs more quickly, you have more food for your ewes. And one of the issues that we have, of course, is trying to make those decisions, certainly in the UK, when it gets to about August, September time. Do you favour the ewes with what dry matter you've got available, or do you favour the lambs? Now, pride says to these guys, but I can't sell my lambs to somebody else to finish. I've got to do it, haven't I? And then pride takes them down the road of their ewes being in poorer condition than they should be. So again, and similarly, if you do get the lambs away and they're growing really, really quickly and they're eating half the amount of dry matter in whatever form you want them to get away, you might be able to increase your profitability by keeping a few more ewes on the same acreage. Yeah? But it is a really difficult one to get through, okay? And when we come to we were talking about anthelmintic resistance and all that side of things as well. There's lots of factors involved in there. But as a hypothesis, I'm putting to you that lamb growth rate is absolutely the holy grail because of its implications for efficiency. So, what we have in the UK, sorry, I'm conscious that I'm really in your way all the time. Are you sure? I've got to stand somewhere. That's the only problem. Yeah, you're okay. So where we are in the UK, and again, it'd be interesting to get some feedback at some stage, but in terms of when we slaughter lambs, is that R3L that I was telling you about earlier, which is basically the standard quality that we're looking for, fat class 3, and an R confirmation, so pretty bog standard confirmation. We would slaughter them at 50% of their mature weight. Does that resonate at all? So that's where we would get that carcass to be. So we know that beyond 50% of mature weight, the efficiency is dropping off like a stone. because you've got a bigger animal, your maintenance requirements going, and they're not growing. They've got to that point where the really efficient muscle laying down, they're just beginning to put fat and bone and all sorts of other stuff that you don't want down beyond that 50%. So just to put it into perspective, that if we were growing at 350 grams a day, sorry, there's a D missing off that, then that would be about 115 days in total. And that's really what we would be expecting. We would like to get to 300, 350 grams a day. So I have a little bit of a question for you guys, because I've been having a look at some of the days to slaughter and so on, and you can shoot me if you like, but I'd suggest that maybe there's some scope for improvement, certainly some over others, okay? I would be surprised if there wasn't, because we have a lot of scope for improvement as well. But to put this into perspective again, our terminal sires, so our Suffolks, Texels and Charolais now, those rams are capable of growing at between 500 and 600 grams a day on forage. So that's just putting into perspective how this is not such a big ask in terms of efficiency. And I will beat our industry up with this and say, well, what on earth are you doing? I was talking to our sheep breeders round table back in November and saying just this, because they are the pedigree breeders and the terminal sire breeders. And I was saying, but guys, you're just not getting your message out there. People are still not capitalising on the genetic potential that we have, which is huge. Okay, so we looked at this earlier on. So one of the things, again, is all about information. I was saying to you earlier on, be careful what you wish for in terms of you need to ask the right questions. So with the software that we've got now, this is actually a piece of software, Border Farm IT, that I've been working with quite a bit over the last 4 or 5 years. But, we can produce this sort of thing, and these graphs aren't particularly good, but this is how it's coming out of the software at the moment, and we've still got some work to do. But with 3 clicks of a mouse, I can produce this sort of thing for a whole lamb crop for a year, providing I can get into the database. My challenge at the moment now is I want it to be cloud-based, so I can do it in real time, because where it's cloud-based, I can actually, one of my guys, he'll be condition scoring and so on, and off his true test, he can actually just cloud it straight up when he's done a session, perhaps 300 ewes, and I can have it in front of me within 30 seconds, and that's what we want. But what we've got, you can just about see those lines going up, so they're growth rate lines, and what we're doing is we've got 2 specific points where we think they are really critical times where we need to judge how well lambs are doing, and then ask the question, if they're not hitting the target, why not? And the first one is 56 days, so that's 8 weeks of age. And of course, what we can do, if the guys are recording from birth, we don't record birth weights because you've got 3,000 lambs, that's just a bit too much to ask. So we will have a perhaps small, medium, or large on the scion. So we'll decide for that flock what small, medium, and large, and that will do. And it will correct it back. So we can do correction factor to 56 days. So the computer will do that for us. And what that's doing is basically giving us a really good feel for how well the ewe has done. So ideally it would be 6 weeks, but I'm not going to ask my guys to weigh 3,000 lambs at 6 weeks of age. That's not funny. So we do it at 8 weeks. But basically that's giving us a feel, how well are our ewe factors functioning? And then we'll go on to 90 days. People talk about weaning, but weaning's a movable feast, so we bring it back to 90 days. And that 90-day figure is really, how well is the lamb doing beyond that? How good is our grazing management for that lamb? How good is our worm control for that lamb? Have we got trace element issues or whatever? So we've got those 2 benchmark points. And then we look at growth rate. So there's 300 grams there. That greeny line there is 300 grams a day. 350 aspirational, that's where this flock needs to get to. 400 would be great. But you can see some animals are doing it. And these are all twins, by the way. This is twins filtered out and just the twin graph. So we can start to do that sort of thing. And what we were tending to find when we start to get to a lot of these figures on flocks is that they're not doing too badly to 8 weeks. Okay, they could do better. They're not doing too badly to 8 weeks. But then from 8 weeks to 90 days, and you saw this earlier on with this flock, they're just pancaking. They were doing virtually nothing. From 8 weeks to 90 days, they were hardly growing at all in a lot of cases. And it was only when people realised that and you start to put in the interventions that you can start to see it. Still not perfect, but we are getting nearer to it. And that's when the EID really comes into its own. You've got that information, it's in there. Okay, I know we're using autos and so on, but 3 clicks of a mouse, bang, it's out. Now, the other thing that we found, and this will be no great surprise to you, but it's really nice to be able to have good, robust data sets to actually prove it, is that if you then go into that graph again, and you go into the background, it's all obviously Access and Excel based, you go in and you pull out the lambs that have not reached where you want them to be at 8 weeks. So what we set is, we say our lambs have got to be, for these sorts of flocks, 20 kilos at 8 weeks of age. That's their KPI. That's our benchmark. If you are 17 kilos or less, and remember this is corrected for age, this isn't just you're younger, this is corrected for age, and we pull them out, that's what happens. They never do any good. They just never do any good. And so one of the things that we've concentrated quite a lot of effort on is, as well as, again, it's this dreadful average word, and just going back to this, obviously what we're trying to do is reduce the variation and try and get more and more of them in range. We've also been concentrating on, who are these guys? Why are they there? What percentage of the flock is it? And that's a KPI in its own sense. We've got to the stage where maybe at 6 weeks we already know what's happening. We might go in and do some. We'll actually wean them off the ewes at that stage, which is really early for us, and creep feed them, because at least then they will grow and they won't die. Yeah? So just using the information like that. The reason why that's happening is we've known this for quite a long while, but we've just not had the robust data to be able to use it as a KPI in its own right, is that if you put an energy restriction on a lamb before it's 30% mature, so remember we're slaughtering at about 50%. So if we're slaughtering lambs at, let's say, 50 kilos, just because of the maths and my brain's a bit old these days, so 50% would be, and they're 100 kilos mature weight, so half of that is 50 kilos. What we're saying is, if they have an energy restriction below 30 kilos, we have a problem. We can't correct it. And the reason why is we don't affect the brain and the eyes, but we do affect key organs like the liver, the intestine. They are reduced in size. So a restriction below 30 kilos, 30%. So this is even older than our 8-week point, and the capacity of the muscles to reduce. So muscle fibre and the potential of that muscle is also compromised beyond that point. And that's what's happening to these guys. We're putting a big restriction on them, be it because the ewes aren't milking, they were small at birth, whatever the reason is, we are unable to then pick them back up and put it right later on. So it really does focus in the importance at this stage of these ewe factors and getting those right. So again, this is some more work. I can't remember where I got this from now, but it's from quite a long while ago, but it really just emphasises this, and as I say, we've now got thousands of bits of data to support it, that percent maturity there. So if 30% or less of their mature weight, if you put everything right beyond that point, the degree of compensation you can expect is about 76%. Above 40%, so when you're getting older lambs, you put a restriction on then, you will then get compensatory growth if you go back, because the organs and everything that they need to be able to respond, you haven't messed with. Okay? So early growth, if you haven't got it up to 8 weeks, we're not going to be able to put it right. So the nutrition of the ewe becomes really, really important. And my final little bit this afternoon, I'll talk to you a little bit about our body condition trial. But it becomes very, very important. And of course, the reason is that in the first 3 weeks of life, the lamb is totally dependent on milk for its growth. Now, nutrition of the ewe is going to affect other things like birth weight. We also know that small lambs are going to struggle in the early stage as well. But in terms of milk yield, we know that ewes that are underfed, and to some extent overfed as well. Overfeeding can have problems because it leads to dystocia. It can lead to a delay in the onset of lactation because ewes have had a difficult lambing. So overfeeding is nearly as bad as underfeeding. It's critical we get that right. So that first bit there, the red line there is ewe's milk. So by 12 weeks of age, the contribution from the ewe is virtually nothing. And the green line there is what the lamb needs in terms of energy. So in that first bit, the lines cross between 3 and 4 weeks of age. Okay, and again, that's a bit that we'll come to that as far as the lamb is concerned, because as far as the lamb is concerned, we need to, the jaws of difference between what the ewe is giving and what the lamb wants, the jaws are getting bigger and bigger and bigger from 4 weeks of age. So we need to be aware of that. But ewe nutrition is critical. And if you get that wrong, there ain't no way we're going to go back. So one of the things that we concentrate really hard on, and I don't know how many of you are feeding ewes indoors or feeding them outside, is to try and get people to think about what the dry matter requirement of ewes is in early lactation. And we've got these things now where we will measure sward height, so grass height, and we can read off from that what the dry matter availability is to the animals at the time. So instead of us just turning ewes and lambs out into a field willy-nilly and saying, oh, well, there's plenty there for you to go at, we'll actually measure how much dry matter is there. And if there isn't enough, we know we need to supplement the ewes. If there is enough, we know we don't need to supplement the ewes. And that work's been going on for a long while, but we've really got back to doing that now because it's absolutely critical that we keep those ewes milking really, really well in the first 3 weeks of lactation. So ewe nutrition, and we haven't got time, as I say, the book, if you want to go on the AHD website, you can download that PDF, and that is the slap bang up to date. If you're really interested, behind it is 110 pages literature review. So everything that's in there is backed up by a literature review as well. So if you're really keen, you can read that as well. So how fast should lambs grow? Well, we found obviously that there's a huge variation in there, and as I alluded to you, that we're not getting anywhere near what the potential is at the moment. And one of the things, we've developed this now within that software, so I think this takes this might take me 4 clicks of a mouse maybe. So that's a whole flock's worth of lambs, and at the 8 weeks, remember what we're looking for is 20 kilos, and there's the distribution around it. So what we're saying is 20 kilos at 8 weeks is just under 300 grams a day, so it's not rocket science. It really isn't growing that quickly. But the guys down at the bottom there, so one of our KPIs is not necessarily what the average at 8 weeks is. That's not really a KPI in that sense, because what's it telling us? It's telling us that some lambs were above it and some lambs were below it, but it's not really telling you what you're then going to do about it. So what we need to do is, so one of our KPIs now that we look at is what percentage of lambs failed. What percentage of lambs failed? That's much more important. And also, how big a spread is there? So instead of having a flock where the bell curve is like that, we can have a flock where it's much, much tighter around where we want them to be. And particularly, we don't want this tail down the bottom end. So it's turning KPIs into nice, cosy bits of information. I'm always challenging the students with this. I say, well, the average growth rate was X. Okay, I'm not interested in that. What I want to know is how many lambs failed to meet X minus 50 or whatever it was in terms of grams per day, because that's much more important. And with your EID, or certainly with our EID, we can then drill down into it and we can say, right, okay, that's them. Who were their mothers? What body condition score were they in at lambing or maybe 6 months before? Were they lame? Whatever. Okay, and then you begin to think, this is what I need to do. This is the question I need to ask. This is what I need to put in place. So there's the average 21 kilos. Okay, that's fine, and that looks quite neat. But as I say, in terms of making progress, it's really more a question of who failed to get to 17, 18 kilos and why. And again, at 90 days, a similar thing. So there, we're looking at 30 kilos as a benchmark to try and achieve, because 30 kilos, again, says that they've been growing, it continued to grow at just under 300 grams a day, which is, again, not rocket science. It's not asking the impossible. It's what we would reasonably expect them to do. And you can see in this flock, it failed in this year, and why we've still got work to do. So 30 kilos is there. It missed it, but again, you can see this great big tail down below. So you might say, oh, well, they didn't miss it by very much, did they? But you just look at how many animals that involved that missed that target, and we need to know why. So you feeding, really important, up to this 30%. But as I've already said, the next part of this equation is, and the bit where the wheels start to come off normally, is that people don't realise that for a lamb, a twin lamb, by 4 weeks of age, the ewe's milk cannot sustain the growth rate that it needs. It cannot. It is not possible for it to do that. So we've basically got 3 choices, haven't we? We either accept that and take what's coming, which I suspect quite a few of our producers do at the moment, which is why they miss the targets to 56 days. Or we can think in terms of providing that lamb with quality grazing that it can utilise. Or if we haven't got that, we put some concentrate feed, or what we would call creep feed, in front of those lambs to fill the jaws. Those are the only 3 choices that you've got, aren't they? The first one's cop-out. The second one is saying, have I got the right level of grazing or not? If I haven't, then I will pay the price unless I do something else about it. Because remember, the price is not just the growth rate to 56 days. It is the fact that you are missing the 30% maturity, and it will be a lifelong miss. Yeah? Okay, so in terms of grazing then, good quality grazing can do it. I've been teaching a lot of vets. The book that we wrote, Kate Phillips and I particularly have fronted it now, and we've actually been doing a Train the Trainer series of meetings this winter, because we're both getting older, and to be honest, we've been talking about sheep nutrition for so long now, we decided it's about time we had a new set of people out there doing our job for when we hang our boots up. And one of the examples we've given the vets to do when they're calculating the diet and calculating protein supplies and so on is what we can get off spring grass. And none of them, we get them to do the calculation and then compare it to what the requirements are, and they can't believe that spring grass can do what spring grass can do, because they've been conditioned into thinking that grass is just sort of any old thing. And that sort of grass can. It will supply everything that they need in late pregnancy, and it will supply everything that they need in early lactation. Good quality grass. They're ruminants. They're a successful species. They wouldn't be successful unless they could actually do that. So basically, as I said before, getting people to actually measure quality grass and how much is there. And we've had this technology, I remember 30 odd years ago, well, when I first came out here, I was already working with people in the UK. And the guy Tim Treacher, who actually started this work in the UK, long before the Kiwis were doing it, I like to remind them, he came up to me at the National Sheep event at Malvern about 5 years ago, and he couldn't believe it. He's retired about 10 years in. He couldn't believe. He said, my God, he said, 10 years after I've retired and 20 odd years after we did the work, at last somebody's listening. So, but measuring sward height, it's just the same. We would ration concentrates. We would ration the feed to use in late pregnancy. There's no difference. It's the same thing. It's an important feed in terms of doing that. So the other thing, and this was actually, when I took it, it was a video, but to be honest, in a forum like this, I'm too nervous to rely on videos these days because the damn things usually go wrong. But these lambs are less than 3 weeks old, and I actually videoed them last spring in the paddock next to me, and they were grazing vigorously. And if you got the video on with the sound, you can hear them munching their way through it. And again, they are doing that because they need to, because that gap is starting to appear. But what we've got to watch is that by doing that, we don't forget that they're picking up potentially. I don't know whether you have a nematodirus. Do you have nematodirus problems in Canada? You can, yeah, okay. It's a major issue to us. And coccidiosis? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, by doing that, they are more open to picking things up that they're going to pick up. Now, we've got to be able to deal with that. But quality grazing like that will sustain and will fill that gap if we can put it in front of them. But we need to just be mindful that these little chaps, there's no point in waiting till they're 5-6 weeks of age before you give them something to fill that gap. I wish I put the video on now because you can actually hear them. I videoed them for ages. Much. Okay, and again, this is you've got this slide in the handouts, but again, if just a very simple slide to remind us that if we want growth rate out of lambs, and to put it in the vernacular, you don't get a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So you've got to put something decent in front of them. So if we want growth rate, up the side there is growth rate. So there's 0 along where the x-axis is. Then we've got 100, 200, 300, 400 grams a day. And then we've got them losing weight. So if you put lambs on poor hay and dead old grass, they're going to lose weight. Quelle surprise. And then as we go up, even with good hay and reasonable big bale silage, we're perhaps going to be able to get maintenance. And then as we move up to be able to get 300, 400 grams a day, we're into really good quality grazing, mainly clover, forage crops. We would have Swedes, turnips, or the guys at the back there were talking about cereals and the quality that you would get there. You'd be in that bracket. And obviously ewe milk up there is right up there as being the source. But again, if we're going to get those growth rates, we've got to make sure that we put something with the energy bang in it, really, so that we can get it. We're not going to get it by putting poor quality forages in front of them. So the guy that you saw when I showed you the photograph earlier on with the big shed where we got 2 big banks of lambs in there, the silage that we're feeding there is big bale silage. I think big bale silage got quite a bad press to start with. My husband, who's over there and kept out of the way today, actually was involved in pioneering big bale silage in the UK in the 1980s. So what he doesn't know about it, he's forgotten more than I know. But we're now getting big bale silage. We can get 11.5, 12 ME silage. I don't know, you probably don't use that. But that is like sort of Rolls-Royce dairy cow clamp silage we'll take now in bales. So the farm that you saw, his best red clover grass silage this time that we're going to feed to the ewes has come out at 12 ME, which is about as good as it gets, even when you put the Rolls-Royce stuff in clamps. So it is really, really good stuff. But we can only do it because it is that good, and he sets out to make really good silage. And if we haven't got that, then this is what we have to do. Or, as I say, we pay the price, particularly up to that 56-day point of that 30% maturity. After that, if we fail to fill the gap, then we're not going to stunt them necessarily, but the price we pay is ever decreasing efficiency. Remember, 100 grams versus 300 grams a day. For every day you're at 100 as opposed to 300, it's costing you twice as much in terms of the food that you're putting in front of them. So there's lots and lots of things in terms of lamb performance factors that we can bring in. And pasture quality and quantity, really important. Ewe nutrition, I'll come back to body condition score before we finish this afternoon. Possibly trace elements. Genetics, yeah, genetics are important, really important. But the problem is that in practice, at the moment, a lot of our guys certainly aren't getting anywhere near capitalising on what the genetic potential is, nowhere near it. And there is an element, dare I say it, and I did voice this at the sheep breeders actually in November, I think there is a slight concern in 1 or 2 of our minds that some of our pedigree breeders have got animals with such phenomenal genetic potential, but that genetic potential isn't necessarily being tested in real life circumstances. So the difference between genotype and phenotype starts to come in, and you start to get a little bit concerned. So there is a project going on in the UK at the moment called RAM Compare. And again, if you go on the AHDB website, there will be information on there. And effectively what they're doing is progeny testing rams on commercial farms. And the results are quite interesting in that they don't necessarily follow the genetic merit of the animals as tested on the pedigree breeding thing. So the jury's out a little bit at the moment, but I think those of us who've had some concerns for a while are feeling a little vindicated. So there's more work to be done on that. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading up about what you guys are doing in the feedlots and so on, I mean, you have got an amazing opportunity to progeny test, particularly if you were to use some AI. And that wouldn't need to be laparoscopic AI. I remember when I was out here 32 years ago, I had with me my cervical AI kit, and I was hopping on planes all over the place. I got heartily sick of explaining to in those days, the security as to what I got this dirty great big battery for, and this speculum and all these wires. In the end, I was just going into the airport going, guys, you're going to get me. Here, let me explain. But I'm a huge potential opportunity with big feedlots to do some progeny testing. I throw that one at you, Elaine, as a challenge. Okay, so worms then. A few words about worms. And we saw this earlier on, and the challenge that we have. The challenge that we have with something like anthelmintic resistance is that it's insidious. So we can get to this stage before people realise they have a problem. And then, Houston, by the time we get to that stage, it's irreversible. Okay? So the problem with anthelmintic resistance, well, let's just talk about worms for a minute. I'd forgotten this slide was in here. So a worm burden does all sorts of things to lambs. Okay, so a clinical worm burden will kill them if it's really bad. And I think Robin was telling me that you've had a brush with Haemoncus. Some of you, a really nasty thing that we have a problem with, and Haemoncus really is a pain in the proverbial, because it tends to, what you'll find is it's there one year and then not the next year, and it jumps up and bites you up the backside when you're least expecting it. It really is a nightmare. But subclinically it's effective, it's depressing appetite. So do you still call it osteotargia in this country, or do you call it telodysagia? One of the main intestinal worms. So what it does is, this is one that doesn't it's not spectacular, but what it does is it just causes anorexia. So it's dropping appetite. So it's not spectacular, and this is why in a lot of cases we get 50% lower growth rate without clinical signs, because basically the animals are just going into anorexia. They're just becoming inappetent, okay? And the impaired mineral uptake, permanent damage to the gut, same with coccidiosis, and reduced protein metabolism, which will affect carcass quality. It will affect accretion of protein into the muscles and reduce it. So that lamb is not a particularly good lamb. He's looking a bit fed up with life. He's not scouring, he's not sick, he's still got his ears up, he's not about to die, but he's not doing particularly well, probably because he's been carrying a subclinical burden. So we're trying to get the message out to our farmers that ineffective worming or worm control is a major, major problem, and that you don't need to be seeing that. You could be seeing animals like that, and unless you're actually measuring your growth rate and you're testing whether or not the anthelmintics that you're using are working properly, and you're timing and targeting your treatments, you could be losing a hell of a lot. Now that's a difficult message to sell, because the animals on the right look okay, don't they? Whereas the animals on the left don't. And one of the reasons for that is what we decided was that after quite a lot of thought, what we needed to do was to turn this problem around so that we were talking about sheep performance in the context of anthelmintic resistance. So what we've got here is the percentage of worms on a farm, on a property, that are resistant to one of the anthelmintic groups, okay? And basically what happens is that once we get to the point where 50% of the worms on a property are resistant, it's pretty obvious. People are trying to control worms. It's pretty obvious it's not working. They've probably got losses. They'll have lambs scouring and really not doing very well. The problem with that is, for those of you who understand, I only understand basic genetics, so Mendelian genetics. The problem with that is that worms are the same as everything else. They carry 2 copies of the gene in the chromosome as we do. There's a copy that they can carry which is for resistance, and there's a copy that can be for susceptibility. So if you're treating your animals properly with an anthelmintic, the only worms that will survive are those with 2 copies for resistance. And this is why your point at the back there was so important earlier on. If you underdose them, you'll only kill the ones with 2 copies for susceptibility. The heterozygotes, with 1 of each, will stay alive. And that material that's resistant, that you should have knocked on the head, those worms will stay alive. So it speeds up the selection for resistance. Okay? As time goes on, once you get to the point where 50% of the worms in the population are resistant, the problem you've got is you're knocking out the susceptibles. There's nothing for the resistance to mate with other than other resistance. So you can't go backwards. You just cannot go backwards once you reach that point. It's the point of no return in terms of the genetics. And if you look at places like South Africa and South America, then they have really big problems, particularly with cattle and anthelmintic resistance. In parts of South Africa, they've had to resort to trying to stuff cattle with susceptible worms, literally stuff some cattle with susceptible worms, and put them out on some of these range areas to try and get susceptible worms to breed back into the worm population. Not very successfully, I have to say. But that's what they've been resorting to. So it's really important then. The point I'm trying to make is, if you've got Haemonchus now and you're starting to come across these problems, if you want to do something anthelmintic resistance, you've got to do it before it's obvious. You have got to intervene before it's obvious, and that goes against human nature. So we can detect, using the methods that we've got, drench tests and fecal egg count reductions, we can test on a farm for resistance at the 5% level. And at that point, 5% or less resistant worms on a farm, we would say the wormers are working perfectly effectively and you get an optimal lamb growth when you're controlling worms properly. But then you've got this whole big bit here, the amber zone, where you're going from 5 to 50, which might take, if you're really silly, you can get down there in 3 years possibly, but it might take 20 years. But all the time, if you're not actually watching it, you're on a slippery slope. And every year, you're getting worse and worse and worse control. That's why I say it's insidious, till you hit the buffers here, and then it's pretty damned obvious. But if we want to intervene and try and slow this process, so this process can take years and years, or it can take very few years. If we want to slow it, you have to intervene when the genetics are in your favour. Are you happy with that? Because it's really, really important, and it's something we still struggle with because it's not obvious to people. But with more and more people weighing more and more EID, it is becoming more apparent to people. The biggest complaint that we get from our sheep farms is my lambs don't grow very well. And the usual thing that they go to is we have a really big industry of people who will sell them lots and lots of potions of boluses and trace elements, and they'll spend thousands of pounds because they think that's what it is. And in a majority of cases, this is what's happening. So they'll spend lots and lots of money and get nowhere. Yeah, the fecal egg counts. So what we do is we use the fecal egg counts to determine whether or not, to help us determine whether or not we need to treat. There's a bit of an issue there in that you've got to use it as a monitoring tool. You can't just use it as a one-off. You've got to know what's going on an ongoing basis, because when you take a fecal egg count from a lamb, you're having a snapshot in terms of what that lamb ate 3 weeks ago. Or if it's Haemonchus, it's 14 days ago because she's got a very short pre-patent period. So you've always got to be mindful that you are monitoring that over time and you understand also what the lamb growth rate is doing. So with the kit that I showed you before, the auto draft with the true test and everything on it, in fact I might just have a photograph of it in a minute. There we go. I'll come back to the other one in a minute. But with that kit now, what we will do is we also know that obviously there's a big variation in terms of, in a group of lambs, as to which ones need treating and which ones don't. Some of them are, particularly if they're being fed very well and they're doing very well, they won't have as high a worm burden and they're tolerating what is going in there and they're building their immunity. So we will now use growth rate. So I will set that machine so that we'll go through a group of lambs, and it depends how old they are and what they're doing, but I might set that to say anything that's doing less than 200 grams a day, auto draft it out for me, I'm going to treat those. Anything that's doing over 200 grams a day, auto draft it that way, and I'm not going to do anything with them. So that's reducing our reliance on anthelmintics. It's reducing the pressure for selection whilst still controlling the worms in the animals. So it's another way that we're using the technology. And it does work, we have done that. We've then gone back and looked at the two groups again just to check, and it does work really well. And there's lots of other things. Okay, so health in lambs is really, really important to the growth rate. And I alluded to this earlier on. The scald issue, the interdigital dermatitis that we would get, which we know now. We were always told for years that it was completely separate. It and foot rot were two completely separate things. But we now know they're not. The interdigital dermatitis is a complete precursor for breaking down the integrity of between the cleats and starting the underrunning of the sole, which is always a part of foot rot. So it is really important. And in terms of growth rates, it absolutely hammers them when you've got scald, hammers them. Pasteurellosis would be another thing that we would have a problem with. Do you have a problem with Pasteurella pneumonia? No? Because a lot of our guys, we would have to vaccinate for it. And joint ill would be another one that we're featuring very highly on at the moment, because obviously joint ill lambs, remember my little KPI of those little devils at 8 weeks, that we want to know who they are and why. A lot of those guys will be ones that have got joint ill. And it's quite a hot topic at the moment, because as you picked up antimicrobial resistance, so we are under mega pressure as well. And we're under a lot of pressure to stop our producers using antibiotic routinely on lambs at birth, which has been going on all too much in recent years. And in order to do that, we've got to tackle some of the predisposing factors to joint ill, such as hygiene, such as ewe nutrition. It all comes back to all the same sorts of things to try and reduce people's reliance on antibiotics, because it's just become a crutch. Okay, so we are using the kit to be able to try help tackle this worm thing. Worm control is really important in sheep production, and the challenge that we face is that unfortunately a lot of our sheep have to graze the same pastures year in and year out because they're on the poorer pastures. We don't get the luxury of being able to rotate very much. If you can put in forage crops and so on, then obviously you're going to be in a good position. What you do have to watch, though, is that you don't fall into the trap of treating animals and putting them straight out onto those forage crops, because even though you might not go back to that area with sheep for another 2 or 3 years, there will still be some worms surviving, and those worms will be 100% resistant. Okay, so the farms that we have the worst resistance problems on are probably our organic producers. And that's not a criticism of the organic producers, but it is because they've tried really, really hard to live without anthelmintics unless they're absolutely necessary. And in doing that, they've done all the right things by having clean grazing. But what the experts didn't tell us was the fastest way to get anthelmintic resistance is to drench all your animals. If you effectively only have double resistant copy worms left in those animals, and then put them on a clean pasture and let them populate it with a thoroughly resistant population. And unfortunately, a lot of our organic guys have fallen into that trap. So if you've got clean grazing, for God's sake, don't do that trick. Particularly with something like Haemonchus, because it's a nightmare. Okay, so in terms of lamb performance then, I think what I'm trying to say to you is that first and foremost, what are your targets? Do you know what you're hitting now at 8 weeks? And at 8 weeks and 90 days might not be exactly the right ones for you, but I think, as a producer group, that's maybe something you can work on. I was looking at some of the figures that Robin gave me, and they may be totally unrepresentative, but it was what I was looking at when I was coming over on the plane yesterday. And it seemed to me that from the figures I had, which was some research, some trials that were done on finishing in feedlots, you were getting better growth rates from going into the feedlot to finishing than you were getting from birth to going to feedlot in those particular trials. And I would just query at that point, that suggests to me that there's quite a lot of scope for better growth rates up to the point when they go in the feedlot. And that I know possibly I don't know how you get paid for them or whatever, but if you were being paid on a per kilo, but there is no reason, I can't see any reason why efficiency up to that point when they go in the feedlot wouldn't pay dividends. Even if you're not the person finishing that lamb at the end, it's still got to be a critical point that you're heading for. And it will make the feedlot people happier as well, because they'll have better lambs coming out the other end. And they'll want to come back, and they should pay you more for it. And it's always, again, you know, we always have this debate in that one of the issues that we have in our sheep industry is that we are hog-tied to run at the pace of the slowest sometimes. And that really does hold back innovation and progressiveness in our top producers, because they're not being paid. And it's not premium, it's differentiation. But as soon as you get into a differentiated situation where the best and the efficient and the ones that are going to make most money as lambs are differentiated from the little guys down the bottom, then you begin to make a lot more progress. And it's all about this, where's the wastage, where are the ones that are letting the side down, and what can we do to get more of them up into this top end, rather than driving at averages. I know, I hate the average word. Okay, so, and I've just put these in there just as a bit of an example. I just use these, I've used this table for our vets and so on, just to give them a feel for what growth rates we're looking at according to how old lambs are when they go. And these are, again, they're much smaller lambs than yours, so you know, you might want to, as a group, produce a table of your own just to have a think about. But you know, our very high ones, so my guys that are on creep, we'll probably start lambing those now in about 3 weeks' time. And they will go some, so they have a KPI, and they've got Lesley on their case if they don't have 70% of their lambs sold by the second week in July, because it's too slow, guys. It's costing you too much. Your creep going up. What the hell are you playing at? So we're looking at 350 to 400 grams a day on those systems, and we're filling the gap with creep. Okay, so we haven't got good quality grazing, we've got very high stocking densities, so we're filling it with creep. And those lambs will eat somewhere between 60 and 80 kilos of creep to finish. So they're costing us 15, 16 pounds a head to do it, but we're getting the price. And then we've got high, which would be our good guys off grass, are doing just under 300 grams a day. Then we've got medium, and then we've got low. And we've got a huge proportion of our industry that are falling into that low category, where they're only doing about 125 grams a day from birth to slaughter. And remember, 100, 300, twice the amount of food. That's costing them. It's risky. They've probably got all sorts of problems going on, and they could be keeping more ewes. Or maybe they could plough a few more acres up and grow another crop, I don't know. But to that, it's costing their business. It really is costing their business. Okay, so there we go. That's that one again. And a question of really bringing all those sorts of things together. But the value of information is amazing. I've waited all my career to be able to do the sort of things I can do now. The last 4 years, I don't know how many thousands of ewes I've condition scored, but you know, it's so powerful. As soon as you can start to look at what you're doing and aspire to get better. So we have a mantra now in terms of particularly sheep performance, and it's, you know, you must be able to, if you can measure it, you can manage it. Okay? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, don't damn well bother. But if you can measure it, you can manage it, because you can aspire to improve. So measuring current performance, you know, where are you now? Where do you want to be? What's realistic in terms of how far you can push that? What are your priorities? Maybe somebody in the room's priorities, having thought about it today, is, well, maybe I do have a few too many empty ewes. Maybe I do need to just up the ante on my culling policy. It could be one small thing that you do differently. So identify a main weakness, and then go and ask the question, and then go and find the solution, because the technical solutions are there. So it might be, I've put that one in deliberately, I'm being really naughty now, but it might be pregnancy scanning. I hit that button again. Find a solution and implement it. So again, it might be using the EID more. It's a slightly less high-tech setup, but using that more to record and use the information. We've got so many people now with so much information that they've recorded EID-wise, and they're not doing anything with it. They're just not doing anything with it. Or it might be feeding, might be forage, it might be anything that you think is something to identify, but measure what you're doing now, and then measure the impact and go round again and go round again. But measure the impact and put some cost benefit on it. There's a great temptation these days to sort of pick bits and pieces from here and there and then not be able to measure whether it's had any impact.